very nice.
Do we want the lights off? Do we want the lights off? What would you prefer?
What would you prefer?
Well, maybe we could have the front ones on, just so I can see other people as well. The slides aren't that important, so if you can't read them perfectly, then that's fine. So thank you all very much for having me in Monasterevin. It's my first time here, and I'm very, very grateful to you for having me. I'll just say a few things informally about what I'm going to say before I launch into the talk proper. So this piece of work is part of a much broader piece of work that I'm thinking about the theory of poetry and how poetry does what it does. So I'm very interested in really old questions about, if I read a poem differently to you, is that a problem? Is that interesting? In what way do I read it differently from you? And what is the history of this sort of thinking? And one thing to bear in mind in this lecture is these ideas are extremely old, at least back to ancient Greece, and people must have been thinking about it before then as well. And one thing I found a lot of in my research is people thinking about how poetry works appears in quite unexpected places. For instance, in the work of St. Augustine, who we usually think of as a deep Christian theologian rather than somebody who was thinking about poetry. So what I'm going to be talking about today is how Hopkins fits into this story, and it touches on all sorts of different areas of thought, theology, philosophy, and also his own poetry. So I've tried to target it at a general audience, but also people that know quite much about Hopkins, so hopefully there's something for everyone. Okay. Hopkins was a man who was unsure about being sure. Not only did he lurch between vastly different philosophical and theological predilections in his life, but when seemingly holding one of these positions, he held it with difficulty. This pattern of thinking characterizes his early and late philosophies. As a young student reading Plato's Republic, the notes that he took read, so this is from his notebooks as a student. Now about contradiction, can a contradiction in terms be true? In one sense, yes. In one sense, no. Of facts, no contradiction is true. For example, that we are both in and out of this room. And those who make fun of contradictions in terms confuse contradiction of the abstract with those of the concrete. In necessity and free will, we look at the same thing in contradictory aspects. So from an early age, you can see that Hopkins's interests in philosophy were attracted to difficulty more so than to clarity. In Plato, he found a self-contradictory answer to the question of whether contradiction can exist. A later essay takes up this same thought. Plato was able to feel the sadness of complex thought, running freely to different conclusions when the old unity of belief, which gives meaning to every subordination of thought and action, was gone. So here he's pitting Plato against Aristotle, who had dominated philosophy in Oxford until relatively recently from Hopkins's perspective. And then in the start of the 19th century, German idealism gets taken up in Oxford for the first time, and this brings them back to Plato through the German idealists of the 18th century. And so what we find in Plato is what Hopkins would go on to call the two worlds, which is an integral part of Plato's philosophy, that we have the material world of the here and now that we can touch and we can feel, and we also have the imagined ideal world of thought and imagination and theology. And these are two worlds which are, and the tension between them is a big part of Plato's philosophy that Hopkins found very interesting. And what's particularly interesting about Hopkins's interest in Plato is it's where Hopkins finds his interest in feeling. So it's not just a question of knowledge and facts, but also emotion. There's a sadness occasioned by the multiplicity of complex thought. So can a contradiction in terms be true? Perhaps, but it's wrapped up in a difficulty which is not only technical, but deeply felt too. Can a contradiction in terms be true? This is the question I want to keep in mind throughout this talk. It was a question to which Hopkins returned in one guise or another throughout his life, as a schoolboy, as a university student, as a poet, as a lecturer, and as a priest. Some of Hopkins's most famous lines are the most perplexing, often because of this will to contradiction. Take, for instance, these lines from the famous poem, As Kingfishers Catch Fire. Each mortal thing does one thing and the same, deals out that being indoors each one dwells, selves, goes itself, myself it speaks and spells, crying, what I do is me, for that I came. The self here speaks to itself as an interlocutor, only to turn back in on itself. Self-consciousness transmuted into self-consternation. And the heavy alliteration that Hopkins learned from Anglo-Saxon poetry gives the impression of the word's appropriateness sonically in a way that masquerades as making sense. This, we know, is one of Hopkins's trademarks, a language which finds itself enwrapped in the consternation of self-consciousness as an aesthetic object to be looked upon, but seemingly self-propelling. Can a contradiction in terms be true? Well, in regard to Hopkins's poetry, the kaleidoscopic uses of languages that make Hopkins so unusual give it one sort of sense. The words are fitting and patterned, and yet they're odd and misplaced. Hopkins's poetry holds contradictions by both making and breaking sense at once. This is also true, I want to suggest, in the subtle business of poetic form. Consider these lines from The Handsome Heart. But tell me, child, your choice. What shall I buy you? Father, what you buy me I like best. With the sweetest air that said, still plied and pressed, he swung to his first poised purport of reply. The line break here suspends two possible readings. The father asking what he ought to buy, or asking what he ought to buy for his son. What shall I buy, or what shall I buy you? The breakage comes to embody the fraught relationship in so much of Hopkins's poetry, present too in as Kingfishers Catch Fire, between self-consciousness and interpersonal exchange. Or perhaps it comes to embody the father's realization of his responsibilities, rounding the corner of the line break, itself rounding the corners of his self-interest. Can a contradiction in terms be true? I want to now take up this question specifically in relation to poetic form, and more specifically too in the terms which Hopkins himself wrote of poetic form. In doing so, my argument is that Hopkins wanted it to be the case, for a host of reasons, that a contradiction in terms could be true. And there are bold practical reasons why Hopkins would have wanted this, for instance, the contradiction between homosexuality and the Victorian Jesuit priesthood. On a more intellectually interesting level, though, I want to suggest that in a piecemeal and often cloudy way, Hopkins developed an epistemology, that is, a theory of knowledge, which relied on contradictions being sustained and used. Hopkins's writings about poetic form elucidate this thinking and set it to work in ways that strikingly have both artistic and moral implications. I started off by saying that Hopkins was a man who was unsure about being sure. And a further argument that lies behind this talk is that Hopkins was part of an important, albeit nebulous, school of thought in the late Victorian period that came to see unsurety as a good rather than as a problem. So let me start this discussion of poetic form by sketching out the main sources of information that we have for Hopkins's thinking. And some of you will know all of this, but it's good to fill in the background. The most often cited piece of writing is the author's preface. And this is a picture of the first printed edition of the author's preface in 1913, which was written in about 1883, but it was in manuscript up to that point. And this lays out for the first time in anything like a formal thesis his theory of sprung rhythm. This is the very odd type of rhythm that he uses that had not been used before, which is the idea that we need not adhere to established stress patterns in English verse, but rather that with a fixed number of stressed beats in a line, there could be any number of unstressed beats. And for many years, scholars came to accept the author's preface as the best and fullest explanation of Hopkins's prosodic idiosyncrasies. It explains sprung rhythm and also the way the ends of poetic lines work. Remark also that it is natural in sprung rhythm for lines to be rove over. That is, for the scanning of each line immediately to take up that of the one before. So that if the first has one or more syllables at its end, the other must have so many less at its beginning. And in fact, the scanning runs on without break from the beginning, say, of a stanza to the end, and all the stanza is of one long strain, though written in lines asunder. There's a great bit of poetry in this very technical analysis as well. The passage is very well known to scholars of Hopkins. Interested in tracing the thought patterns of the poet, this passage seems to explain how run-on lines, or enjambments as they're called in technical prosodic language, figured in Hopkins's poetic imagination. Put simply, a contradiction in terms can be true. The line is both rove over, and yet the poem is written in lines asunder. That is to say, readers can read across and over the line breaks, while at the same time acknowledging that there is a break. And there are many precedents in English writing to these sorts of statements. Some of them rather choleric, as when Dr. Johnson, said that Milton's Paradise Lost was verse to the eye only, because it was written in blank verse, and he felt that there was no relevance to the line breaks in Paradise Lost. And some of these statements are more thoughtful, as when Wordsworth writes to his letter John Thelball, noting that the passion of metre has a directive power to the ends of lines, even if the phrase does not end with the line. So people have been thinking about this for a long time, particularly in the 100 years before Hopkins comes to write. The author's preface is somewhat tight-lipped about just how this functions, and like the rest of the piece, is therefore quite opaque. The Hopkins scholar Michael Hurley has written that the debonair attitude of the author's preface has in some ways done more to cloud than to clarify his prosody. Notwithstanding this being the case, we might treat the author's preface as an introduction to Hopkins's prosody, not in the sense that it chronologically came first in his development, as there are many letters and less formal writings that come before it, but in the sense that it provides a framework for us to proceed. A decade before he wrote the author's preface, Hopkins was lecturing at Roehampton on the history of philosophy, theology, and rhetoric, and the remnant notes with which he prepared for these lectures, beautifully republished recently in the Oxford University Press edition, which if you can get hold of, it's absolutely brilliant. I mean, I wouldn't buy it because you'll have to remortgage your house, but if you can have a look at it in a library, it's really very brilliant. And these notes are Hopkinsian in a variety of senses. They are messy and difficult, polymathic, intensely learned, multilingual, and incomplete. They also ought to be read in the understanding that this is not necessarily what Hopkins thought in the truest sense, but rather this is what he thought ought to be taught to the undergraduates at Roehampton. Despite all of this, or perhaps because of it, they give an intimate sense of Hopkins's grappling with poetic form, a grappling which was itself messy, difficult, polymathic, intensely learned, multilingual, and incomplete. They begin with rather lengthy definitions of terms. So he says that metre is the grouping of a certain number of feet, and he says that a line is an intermediate division between foot and verse, like a clause that marked off by rhyme what other means, for we must judge by the ear, not by reading and the eye. And these are rather dry definitions, but I want to suggest they're not only that. They also give a sense of the character of Hopkins the prosodist. Verse form for Hopkins is a matter of concentrically nested groupings which give an overall effect. He's interested in how the many elements of form work in concert or in contrast with one another. And the distinction he draws in the author's preface between the heard and silently read effects of formal verse ought also to be seen as an acknowledgement of the plurality of verse. One sense might deceive the other. One element is nested within another. And this is especially true in his odd and controversial theory of poetic counterpoint, which, if I can try to summarize it, even though it's not very summarizable, is the theory that verse can run two different rhythmic patterns on top of one another at the same time, as long as the counting of stressed beats starts in different places. And he said this in the author's preface in even briefer terms than I've just said now. But in the Roehampton notes, which I was just talking about, he takes this theory up in more detail. So when caesura, so caesura is the break in the middle of a line of verse that's from classical verse theory. When the caesura is fixed by rule, we have rhythmic counterpoint. By counterpoint, I mean the carrying on of two figures at once, especially if they are alike in kind, but very unlike or opposite in species. Referring to a classical idea of caesura here, the cut in the middle of a line of verse, caesura being the same derivation as Caesarean section, which is cut in German. Hopkins suggests that two unlike or opposite species of rhythm can occur at once. The line and the half line become two alternative forms of division, and the patterns of the poem might run from caesura to caesura rather than from the start to the end of a line. So, can a contradiction in terms be true? For Hopkins the prosodist, yes. Now, I just want to say very briefly that this sort of thinking has not really taken off. It's not sort of influenced the history of prosody since then. It is quite an idiosyncratic way of thinking. But I think because of that, it's all the more interesting. That why did this man have this quite radical theory of poetry that hasn't really taken off? It gives us an insight into Hopkins's poetic mind, but also his mind as an epistemologist. Poetic meaning for Hopkins need not be exclusive. What I mean by that is his thinking is accommodating of plural ways of being at once. In the set of notes that I quoted right at the start of this talk, the ones he took as a young student, in which we find the question, can a contradiction in terms be true? Hopkins offers briefly a characterization of thinking that might accommodate this much later theory of prosody. He says, ancient philosophy distinguished the reasoning, concupiscent, which means sexual, and thumos part of the mind. And the latter is our difficulty. It answers most to indignation. So thumos is the word that Plato uses for one part of the divided soul, the part which attended to the emotional aspect of virtue. So joy, amusement, etc. are all parts of thumos. And I will return to the moral aspect of this later, but for now let me say that from an early age, Hopkins was deeply interested in the part of the soul which experiences things non-reasonably, outside of deliberative or scientistic intelligence. And in the Roehampton notes on prosody, he never explicitly invokes this sort of thinking, but it is, I suggest, necessary to understand this theory of poetry. And he does, nonetheless, draw on Platonic terms. So this is from his lecture notes at Roehampton. It should be understood that these various means of breaking the sameness of rhythm, and especially caesura, do not break the unity of the verse, but the contrary. They make it organic, and what is organic is one. All the parts of water are alike, but the parts of man's body differ, and man's individuality is marked. But the individual being a water drop has, but the individual being a water drop has is gone when it falls into water again. This is a sort of what's called mereology, the study of the relations between parts and wholes, which is very common in the Neoplatonic tradition. What is expressed here in the metaphor of the contradiction between water droplets' individuality and their combined unity makes use of the same logic as Hopkins's mereological approach to feet, lines, and meters. Fitting into each other and yet retaining their individuality, the facets of poetic form work both in concert and alone. This sort of thinking does not merely come from a general interest in Neoplatonism. Turning briefly to the subject of rests as an example of verse in absence, and therefore another example of verse's committedness to the value of contradiction, Hopkins writes, I forgot a quote for this, that's okay, I shall read it out. Rests are allowed for in the verse of the ancients, and though not professedly, in ours, though there are instances collected from Shakespeare, like the rests in music. And then he says, and this is the interesting part, see St. Augustine, De Musica, Book 3, which was something that I never expected to find in Hopkins's really sort of detailed notes on prosody, that he was going to go to St. Augustine, the very early church father, to explain this. Here's a lovely picture of Augustine. The work that Hopkins refers to here is the early work by Augustine, De Musica, which was the first of a planned series of volumes on the liberal arts, but the only one that Augustine ever wrote. So Augustine had this idea that he was going to be a sort of art historian and an art theorist, as well as a theologian, but it never quite took off. Hopkins's lectures are closely aligned with De Musica throughout, whether that's in their discussion of the mereology of verse, the value of rests, the importance of caesura, or the change in metrical convention across time. These are all really important topics in De Musica. Hopkins makes two references to De Musica in the lecture notes, and a further reference in a letter to Richard Dixon in October 1881, here on the subject of ratio in verse. And despite these fleeting references, I want to suggest today that not only was Hopkins following Augustine's technical analysis in his own theory of verse, but that the underlying epistemology of De Musica, and indeed the much more famous Confessions of St. Augustine, underscores Hopkins's philosophy of form. Some of you are probably wondering if I've forgotten what I called this talk at this point, but now we get into the Augustine stuff. The relationship between these two thinkers has been briefly explored by mid-century scholars, so people sort of writing 70 years ago, where the trends in scholarship were very different. They were much less speculative and much less sort of exploratory and more sort of documentary, just showing where the sort of matching up of the two thinkers comes. What really hasn't been studied is the prosodic importance of all this stuff. So how does it get into the theory of poetry? It's almost exclusively been studied by theologians. Up until now, I've been suggesting that the specific frames of knowledge that Hopkins needed for his idiosyncratic understanding of poetic form are, to put it simply, slightly odd, or at least counterintuitive. Hopkins's Platonic and Neoplatonic interests go some way towards suggesting an intellectual background for this poetics. In Augustine, himself an inheritor of Neoplatonist thinking, especially on Mariology, so Mariology being the study of parts fitting into wholes, which is most famously in Augustine in his major writings on the Trinity being three parts of God, but also one God. Hopkins found an example of how to synthesize the moral theological side of poetic form and its technical business, such that in the knotty writings on sprung rhythm, in stress, and counterpoint, we find not the evasion of a poet whose forms have run away with him, but rather a theory of poetry which is deeply felt and philosophically sophisticated. Hopkins said that the Confessions was the most interesting book I ever read, and scholars have previously noted that Hopkins's theory of aesthetics is influenced by the Confessions. Emily Merriman, a brilliant Hopkins and Augustine scholar, in a superb paper, has noted that Hopkins saw Augustine as an authority on the relationship between proportion and beauty. Much of this relationship remains unexamined, however, not least the important distinction between the troubled, doubting Augustine of the Confessions and the programmatic, didactic Augustine of De Musica. So there's two very different styles of writing in Augustine. It appears that Hopkins turns to De Musica because of its synthesis of the technical and the theological, and Augustine's beginning his career as a rhetorician before becoming a theologian parallels Hopkins's own life too. It's also important to say that De Musica was a rarely acknowledged text by 19th century poets and poetry scholars, which suggests that Hopkins's attraction to it was a personal one. De Musica itself stands as representative of the synthesized division in Augustine of the rhetor and the theologian. The text is written in 6 books, and the first 5 books are written before Augustine converts to Christianity. So they're very technical and pagan and not concerned with God. And then in the 6th book, after he's converted to Christianity, you get this wonderful theory of why this all matters in a theological way. So it's quite an interesting text in its own right as well, because it sort of has these 2 people writing it, but the 2 people are one person. So it's worth having a look at if you're interested in this sort of thing. De Musica is also a book which is Neoplatonic in colouring, most visibly in its obsessive consideration of the Mariology and numerology of verse features. Augustine writes in De Musica, the mean agrees with the extremes and the extremes with the mean, and therefore, just as there is a certain virtue in 3, in that it is placed in order after 1 and 2, while consisting of 1 and 2, there is a certain virtue in 4, in that it falls in counting after 1, 2, and 3, while consisting of 1 and 3, or twice 2. So this is a very classic sort of way of writing in late antiquity, just showing how numbers all fit together, and isn't that wonderful, and isn't God's creation so perfect because all the numbers add up. It's quite simple stuff to us now, but to them it's a very important sort of fact in life that the numbers add up, and without God's grace they wouldn't do. And Hopkins' discussion of rests are almost exact paraphrases of Augustine's. So Augustine writes, what is more extended or what is given as a rest have both a time value. And he says, you must hold there are fixed rest intervals in meters, and so when you have found some defect in a regular foot, you ought to consider whether there will be compensation when the rest has been measured and accounted for. Okay, before I go further on that, it's important to recognise what the word musica means here. It doesn't mean music, although the Latin word musica does also mean music. It's not the study of harmony and melody. It's more poetic music, so it's a study of what we would now call poetics. However, the theological elements of the treatise in Book 6 see musica take on a different meaning, which it almost never has now, and which, in the words of the wonderful theologian Catherine Pickstock, music measured the relationship between the soul and the body. So when we use the word harmony now in a more abstract sense, not just referring to music, this is the sort of music that musica refers to as well. So when we say, I'm in harmony with him, or I'm in harmony with God, this is the sort of musica that Augustine is interested in, as well as the technical business of poetic form. This is very commonplace in late antiquity, as music was seen to tap into the movement of the heavenly bodies, and its somatic qualities were seen as connective with theology. As Catherine Pickstock puts it, music becomes the science that most leads towards theology. For Augustine, the technical business of poetics and theological truth are not just linked, but one and the same. I mentioned earlier in relation to the handsome heart that the ends of poetic lines are a flashpoint for Hopkinsian pluralistic poetics. It's then both surprising and pleasing that Augustine, taking some time out from writing the foundational text of Christianity, takes up the line ending as a model of synthesis of moral and technical correctness in verse. So you can imagine that I was very surprised to find this in this very dense theological treatise. So this is Augustine on line endings. Next, we must look to the ending of verse, for they, the early verse theorists, wanted this also to be marked and distinguished by some difference, or rather reason itself wanted it so. Don't you think it better the ending confining the numbers forward roll, with the equality of times undisturbed, should stand out rather than be confused with the other parts not effecting an ending? Augustine's term forward roll here, which in Latin is provolutio, which is interestingly a very, very rare word. Some people think this is the first attestation of this word, so he has to invent a new word in Latin to describe this function of poetic form. I want to suggest that it parallels Hopkins' term rove over, which is also the first attestation of that word in English. Nobody had ever used this term rove over before. So it may be that reading this, he thinks, what's this? Because he would have read it in Latin. He thinks, I've never seen this Latin word before. I should coin a new English word in order to refer to the same thing. Yes, and the other thing that matches up with Hopkins in this passage is Augustine eschewing reason in place of something else. When we were talking about Hopkins' thumos earlier, the idea that there's a part of the mind which is interested in non-reasoning, interested in something that's non-deliberative. And so there seems to be a Neoplatonic inheritance to all of this in Hopkins. The function of thumos allows the equality of times, as Augustine puts it, to be undisturbed while concurrently standing out. This dual function of the line ending concurs with Hopkins' description, and may well have provided the images for it. Toward the end of Book 5, and therefore still pre-conversion to Christianity, still in the pagan mode, Augustine essays an epistemological scaffold for this sort of thinking, which he resolves to be a distinction between styles of attention. He says, "To the fact we do not everywhere get the time difference only in brevity and length. You don't say, do you, the difference of summer and winter is one of time, or rather of a shorter and longer interval." What he means by that is, it's not that summer and winter are longer or shorter than one another. The fact that they're two different times is a different meaning of the word time. It's not about the measurement of time. And don't you place it in the power of cold and hot, or of dry and wet, or any other thing like that. Which I think this what I've just read is a wonderful idea that there are different ways of measuring time. It doesn't have to be about one thing being longer than another or marking it on a calendar. There are different qualities that time might have. Time, Augustine says, is not singularly a question of mathematics, but might also be viewed qualitatively. The analogy he implies with his discussion of the ends of poetic lines is that the line might be quantitatively measured and therefore stand out, but might be qualitatively felt to roll forward. This distinction might be codified as the difference between what is and what is perceived, which Augustine maintains is a distinction which might be useful to sustain. In the specific case of whether the final foot of a hexameter line, which is the common meter of most Latin poetry, whether the final foot ought to be different, he writes, in the measuring of verse, the inveterate will of man, and not the external ratio of things, is to be considered, since we first perceive its measured length naturally by the ear, and then establish it by the rational consideration of numbers. And since anyone judging this meter to be properly completed more surely than other meters, judges it must close with a distinctive ending, and since it is clear such an ending must be marked by a shorter time, for this confines the length of time and somehow checks it. So that's a very technical bit about hexameter lines, but it's, I suppose the point that I want to make from that is that Augustine was obsessed with the ends of poetic lines. He felt that this is where the sort of weight of the line comes into being. And this is a very enduring idea in Latin poetry, that the end of the line is where so much of the value of the line comes from. So in a different piece of work that I'm working on at the moment, 19th century school kids were taught, nearly all of their Latin training was taught in writing Latin poetry. So they would be asked to write poems in Latin, and that's how they learned the language. And a lot of the school books say the really important bit to get right is the last word of the line. And so this is a really enduring idea in Latin poetry. So here, Augustine takes up the problem of subjective will and objective externality as an expression of verse form, which is one of the most enduring features of poetics to this day. So this is the idea that I mentioned before I started reading the talk about how do we deal with the fact that if I read poetry differently from you, does that mean the poem doesn't exist in some objective way? Or is there just different ways in which the poem can exist? Can it exist objectively on the page, but also subjectively in the way that we read it? Hopkins expresses this idea of the Roehampton notes less delicately as, quote, we must judge by the ear, not by reading, and the eye. It is such an enduring idea because in its essence, it's an expression of Platonic idealism, of the division between an imagined and a material world. In the first 5 books of De Musica, Augustine merely states this binary, and in book 6, he explores how it might be resolved through God. Before we talk about book 6, which is one of the hardest pieces of text that I've ever had to work with, it's useful to look briefly at the later Augustine of the Confessions, where he gives us what is known as his theory of distentio animi, that's the distension of the soul. Augustine submits in the Confessions that time, at least in some contexts, cannot be measured in reference to external sources of data, but instead must come from within. And he puts this like this. This is why it seems to me that time is nothing other than a form of distension. But what kind of distension, I do not know. And it would be surprising if it were not a distension of the mind itself. So what he's getting at here is that the 2 different ways of measuring time, the numbers and also the way in which we measure the seasons, this qualitative way, require us to think in 2 different ways at the same time. We have to be able to sort of distend our mind, to stretch our mind, to sort of break out of the reasonable way that we normally think into a different way of thinking. This passage hedges its bets, though, Augustine thinking aloud, as he often does in the Confessions. And this is, I suggest, the central tenet of Augustine's theory of time, and no less his theory of verse. It requires the mind to be impossibly, but assuredly expanded into multiple styles of attention at once, to be extended both in a mathematical sense of time and in a qualitative sense. Several paragraphs later, he applies the same term, distentio, to reading poetry. He's writing of the experience of reciting a poem or a psalm, and the odd fact, as he sees it, that one must say each word alone and yet project oneself across the whole poem in order to read it. So this is a much more readable piece of Hopkins, which makes the point really well, I think. Imagine that I'm about to recite a poem that I know. Before I start, my expectation extends to the poem as a whole. But once I begin, whatever part of that expectation I have plucked away goes into the past and is retained in my memory. The life force of my performance is distended both ways between memory, because of what I've already spoken, and expectation, because of what I have yet to say. The best example that Augustine can find for this distension of time, therefore, is poetry. The mind must be impossibly extended in such a way as to exist in 2 timescales at once. And this convolution is reflected in the complexity of the meaning of the word distentio. This is a very complex word in Latin, which I'm going to very briefly run over why it's so complex. So St. Jerome, who translated the Bible from its original vernacular languages into Latin, and who is a towering influence on Augustine's thinking, used the word distentio to refer to an enormous range of things. It means, in St. Jerome's Vulgate translation of the Bible, it means torture, akin to the modern English medical usage of distended. If you've got a distended part of your body, that's a torturous part of your body. It also means business or occupation, as in that which is occupied by stretching, by distending yourself. It also means afflicted, as in something one has to stretch oneself in order to deal with. It's a word then which contains multitudes. In Christian context, though, it's important to recognize that these contexts are often worrying, often relating to wounding or punishment or torture or whatever it might be. But it also has more benign resonances as something one does with one's time. So this word, central to Augustine's theory of poetry, is related in its meanings to a word central in Hopkins' theory of poetry, which I've not yet mentioned, in stress. As many of you will know, Hopkins uses this word in stress to refer to the warring meanings held by a single word and the interaction of words in poetry, but he also uses it to refer to the reader of poetry, as in Augustine's distentio, not just concerned with the phenomena of poetry, but how it's experienced too. He speaks of the force of poetry putting the reader in stress, and he also sees the Christian sinner in stress. It's a word that, for Hopkins, represents the continuing existence of difficulty. So to return to my earlier question, can a contradiction in terms be true? Well, in both distentio and in stress, there are clear contradictions. They are the forces that keep the Christian reader sustained and create the life force of poetry, but their exigencies, their difficulties, are nonetheless real. They are torturous and life-bringing. This contradiction, then, is the essence of what it means to read poetry, and, for Augustine and Hopkins at least, what it means to be Christian. Poetry breaks down our linear conception of time in so powerful a way that it acts as an exemplar to humans how to conceive the world. To quote Rowan Williams, our capacity to think what is there, noetics, is neither separable from nor identical with the judgment that it is in fact there, ontics. It's in this way that poetry is religious for Augustine. It allows us to actively and consciously perform the distentio entailed more commonly in Christian life, such that the doubleness of humanity, Hopkins' Platonic two worlds, might be brought to a unity in God. So this is a very important part of Trinitarian theology, that God can be both man and God at once, and it bridges the two Platonic worlds. Now, to return to De Musica, as I come to an end. The problem of how to hold together the difficulty of subjectivity and objectivity, that is, the reader's experience of the poem and the poem as it is on the page, as when choosing whether to read across an enjambed line, choosing whether to read across a run-on line or not, is the purpose of De Musica according to its author, and to find a unification through God. Augustine's Poetics aims to create a concert for man and God, which can make space for both subjective judgments and ontic truth. De Musica, I probably should have said at the start, is written as a Socratic dialogue, so there's this very stupid and dumb disciple that asks all these very obvious questions, just so that then the teacher can say, well, what you need to know is this, and it runs like this throughout the whole thing. So, in Book 6 of De Musica, the disciple, the student, says as follows: because sensing and remembering both belong to the soul, I am not disturbed if I should prefer something produced in the soul to something else likewise. But I am disturbed how the sounding rhythms of verse, certainly corporeal or somehow in a body, are to be considered of more worth than those found in the soul when we sense. And yet again, it's disturbing how these last are not rather to be more highly considered, since they make, and the others are made by them. So this is basically the idea. How is it the case that we privilege subjective readings rather than the objective bit on the page? Why is that the case? This is a totally understandable confusion, especially in De Musica, because Confessions is written half a lifetime later. And so the poor disciple doesn't have the sort of brilliant piece of philosophical thinking that we've just heard from the Confessions. But the question is, how is it possible that a man can both sense and remember something, that is, sense and reproduce it, at once, as both the receptor of a poem and the agent of the poem, the one that takes on the poem but also produces the poem as you read aloud? Augustine's master responds with an intensely profound reflection on the relationship between poetry and God. And this is the longest quotation, but it is not at all warning. Okay, I will read it. Be rather amazed at the body's being able to make anything in the soul, for it could not, perhaps, If the body the soul used to animate and govern without trouble and with the greatest ease, changed for the worse by the first sin, were not subject to death and corruption. And neither its wound nor its disease has deserved to be without the honour of some ornament. And the highest wisdom of God designed to assume that wound by means of a wonderful and ineffable sacrament, when he took upon himself man without sin, but not without the condition of sin. For he was willing to be humanly born, to suffer, and to die. He undeservingly suffered, and so with calm mind we might pay the death owed, if he too were able to bear it unowed on our account. And anything else more secret and more atoned for in such a sacrament to be understood by saintly and more holy people. And so it is not surprising a soul, operating in mortal flesh, feels the passion of bodies. So in being both transcendental and material, according to Augustine, poetry is equivalent to Christ. Augustine's Christology is, throughout his work, the place where his Platonism, his belief in the unifying of the two worlds, of the material and the imagined, where poetry can be both body and soul, material and imagined, can be felt both somatically and intellectually. So basically what's happening in this passage is Augustine says that given that Christ can be both God and man, poetry can be both material and imagined. It's quite intense stuff, but quite beautiful. At the same time, this type of distentio between the imagined and the material invokes the importance of suffering, also found in Confessions. The torture of distentio is found in the suffering of Christ as both man and God, material and ideal, objective and subjective. Yet the wound this leaves is assumed not to be lasting suffering, but as sacrament, which is both wonderful and ineffable. Words that make use of the two poles of poetry's magic, poetry's wonderful and ineffable. The final sentence here mechanizes and literalizes these functions as the soul, the animus from distentio animi, operates in flesh and so feels the material body. Can you be within time when you see what happens in time? Asks the Augustine of the Confessions. Can a contradiction in terms be true? Asks the young Hopkins. I've been suggesting that in Augustine we can find a conception of poetic form which is trans-historical, but which Hopkins and his contemporaries would have recognised, and which underscored Hopkins's own poetics in ways that have been treated only in passing by scholarship. In De Musica, Hopkins would have found the odd term provolutio, which directly or indirectly lies behind Hopkins's enigmatic term rove over. In the Confessions, Hopkins would have found Augustine's distentio animi applied both to the difficult problem of Platonic transcendence as to poetic form itself, which may well, in it being tortuous but abiding, suffering but capacious, have underscored Hopkins's concept of interest. Augustine's Platonism was consonant with much of Hopkins's learning at Oxford and his teaching at Roehampton, such that it may have provided deep and material exemplars to an already fertile poetics of the Platonist Hopkins. Hopkins once described himself as, quote, ruined for life by my alleged singularities. And here he's referring to his politicised pigeonholing from which he suffered. But it's also a phrase that may apply to his Augustinian poetics, whereby multiplicity is privileged as inhering in Christ. This sort of intellectual history has its primary importance in shedding light on Hopkins's poetics and perhaps on how to read poetry more generally. By way of conclusion, I want to consider the moral implications of this. There's clearly something moral going on in Augustine, and that it's about God, so what can we do with this? And maybe what can we take as a secular interpretation of this rather than solely a religious one? The second part of my title, One Way of Reading Poetry, I mean not only to suggest that I will give one way to read, but also that the singularity of our reading is significant to these discussions. My one way of reading may well be different from yours, and yet Augustine and Hopkins suggest that this division in subjectivity might be resolved or usefully sustained to give a fuller impression of how poetry works. Self-abnegation, giving ourselves up, is necessary for reading poetry. Political and moral philosophers have, since the emergence of their disciplines, been interested in how to deal with the fact that people have different interests and that these interests might be conflicting. And one philosopher I want to think about now is, perhaps unexpectedly, Iris Murdoch, who I think is vastly underread as a philosopher. Her novels are obviously brilliant, but her philosophical essays are wonderfully readable for people that are not trained philosophers, but so inspiring and have had a huge impact on me. Iris Murdoch calls the sort of self-interest which makes us believe in our own aesthetic and moral judgments, that might be the judgments that make me think I'm reading this poem correctly and you're reading it incorrectly. She terms this neurosis. In her essay, which you can read in an hour, but is absolutely marvellous, called The Sovereignty of Good, which if you take one thing away from this talk, go and read Iris Murdoch's essay, The Sovereignty of Good. It's absolutely phenomenal. She suggests that diverting our attention to that which is outside ourselves, we might say distending our attention, we find the good. She says. This is one of my favourite pieces of writing ever, so I hope you enjoy it. I'm looking out of my window in an anxious and resentful state of mind, oblivious to my surroundings, brooding perhaps on some damage done to my prestige. Then suddenly I observe a hovering kestrel. In a moment, everything is altered. The brooding self, with its hurt vanity, has disappeared. There is nothing now but kestrel. And when I return to thinking of the other matter, it seems less important. So in this talk, I've been laying out a theory of poetics which forces us to accept the different functions of poetry at once, which holds the tension between these different readings intact, because they are, through their tortuousness, what Augustine and Hopkins would have called godly. Murdoch suggests, in what we might consider to be a secular or an atheist reimagining of a similar idea, that by lifting ourselves out of ourselves, we see this difference. We see ourselves as one part in the whole of the world. The Bible tells us that God is love. Murdoch, in another essay, suggests that love is the sudden realization that other people exist. As when observing a delicate feathered creature, we are lifted out of ourselves. By way of the technical, knotty, and messy history of Hopkins and Augustine's poetics, I've today been suggesting that not only does poetry entail the acceptance of difference and pluralism, but that in doing so, perhaps by way of the love of Christ, or perhaps not, by the fact that a contradiction in terms can be true, poetry brings us to what is good. Thank you very much. I think there's time for a few questions. If anybody would like. Yes, please.
Yes?
Yes, yeah, please.
Sorry, there's one word you used, I didn't quite get all the meaning of it. Was it ontic?
Ontic, yes. So you might have heard the word ontology.
Yes, I have heard ontology.
So it's from
I've
the same...
never understood ontology.
So ontology is the study of being, and it's often put up against epistemology. So epistemology is the study of knowledge, so how do I know what I know? And ontology is the study of being.
Okay.
So ontic it's often a word that is used where it doesn't need to be used, because it basically means the state of being.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to think of a useful example. So my epistemology of myself is, how do I know that I'm here? My ontology of myself is, in what way am I here? How do I exist in the world? So it's a slightly odd distinction, but a very important one for ancient philosophy. It sort of dropped out of favour as a term. In ancient Greek philosophy, they were very interested in how do I know that I'm here? So, for instance, cogito ergo sum, Descartes' great statement, is an example of ontology, trying to work out how do I know that I'm here in the world, being now. I hope that answers your question.
Yes, well, yes. Starts with
Yes. Yes.
Thank you for a fascinating talk. I've learned such a lot.
Great.
I don't know where to start with all the minds buzzing at the moment, but one of the things that you highlighted, which I wasn't aware of, is that Augustine was obsessed with the end of the line, and the last word was vital. And I just wanted to check, would that be the last word of every line in the poem, for example, a sonnet, 14 words?
Well, yes, so he was interested in feet as well, so poetic feet, which is much more, as I'm sure you know, rigorous in Latin poetry, to the point where people, Latin poets, corrupt words and change words so that they fit into the feet. So in that context, it makes a lot more sense. But yes, it's exactly that he really genuinely thought that the end of the line was more interesting than the rest of the line, which is fascinating. And I'm still working on this question, and I suppose what I'm interested in is where does Augustine get that from? Because it doesn't seem to be present in the earlier theories of poetry from sort of Aristotelians and things like that. It doesn't seem to go that far back, which makes me think it has some basis in a different branch of thinking. So maybe theology being fascinated about beginnings and ends, and the end being a sort of theological importance as well. But I'm still thinking about that, because so as a sort of student of modern poetry, what I'm used to being able to do is going to find the manuscripts in an archive somewhere and working out where they got it from. Can't do that with Augustine. We don't have his sort of letters to his mates or anything like that, so it's a bit harder to find out where these things came from.
But it's very interesting what you say about how Augustine influenced Hopkins and how this hasn't really been explored before. And it's made me think, just off the top of my head, Felix Randall ending his bright and battering sandal, this climax, this huge climax. And I wondered if there might be more attention given to the last word of the poem as well.
Yeah.
Even greater than the last words. But
yeah, I think that's exactly right. And it's interesting because the sort of richer the school, the more likely their records were in good order. So sadly, we don't have many of Hopkins' school records, but other public schools at the time that do have records show that people were sort of really drilled on these last words of the lines. So the sort of habits that he must have formed from writing Latin poetry in school would have really, really sort of lasted, yes. I think, in those ways. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
No problem. Yes.
First of all, thank you for an absolutely fascinating talk.
Thank you.
The contradictions that you were kind of alluding to, this is a very broad question, but do you see those also reflected in Hopkins' life as a poet versus priest, if there's such a thing? But
yeah, I think it's a good question. I think it's very interesting at sort of times of change in Hopkins' life. He often makes quite radical decisions, flitting between different types of religion, wrestling with his sexuality, wrestling with different types of poetry, and he often makes quite quick decisions, which is something I find quite interesting. It doesn't take him that long to say, yes, I'm now going to be a Jesuit priest, which you think would be quite a large decision to make in your life. And I'm very interested in why that's the case, and I'm wondering if part of the reason is because he doesn't find contradiction as difficult as maybe some of us do. He might think that despite the fact that a lot of my thinking disagrees with this decision, nonetheless I can make the decision, which I suppose is a way of finding peace in difficulty in a way, but yeah, it's a really good question. I'm not hugely knowledgeable about Hopkins' biography, but I think it's definitely there somewhere.
Yeah.
The way in which these flashpoints of change really do happen very quickly compared to other people in a similar position.
Thanks, Liz.
Yes, please.
I'm just curious with the mental capacity of Hopkins and his thinking and his expansion into theology and the meaning of life and all that sort of thing. Why did he have to put such a complicated construction on his poetry? Could he have not said it in a more direct way, a more telling, feeling, a more connected way than what he did?
Well, I think it's a really good question, and there's at least two things I would say about that. One of them is that Hopkins' influences, the people who influenced him, were hugely varied. And so there's Welsh poetry in there, there's the classics in there, there's Anglo-Saxon poetry, there's the psalms, all hugely different traditions of poetry. So some of the what I found the most lucid explanations of Hopkins' bizarre theories of prosody is through the Anglo-Saxon lens, because if you know a bit about Anglo-Saxon prosody, it starts to make a lot more sense. The fact that it doesn't match up into iambic pentameter is explained a lot by the fact that a lot of it comes from Anglo-Saxon poetry. So that's one thing I would say. The other thing, which is more pertinent to your question about why couldn't he express himself more clearly, I think it's important to remember that he never intended most of this stuff to be made public. He wrote notes for his lectures, which are very much notes, there's sort of crossings out and scribbles and all sorts of things, and then would have delivered the lecture in a more, I imagine, a more professional way. So that's one way in which his work was never meant to see the light, but as I'm sure you know as well, nearly all of his poems were shoved in a drawer and given to Robert Bridges. And so I think he would be quite perplexed by the fact that we're stood in this hall now talking about it in this sort of analytical way. But it's interesting, isn't it, that if somebody doesn't have to prepare things for posterity, then they don't prepare it in a very controlled way. I suppose one analogy I might draw is with T.S. Eliot, who for many, many, many years, he was thought to have had quite a coherent body of work writing about poetry. And then in the last few years, his complete prose in 8 huge volumes have been published, and it just shows that he was as messy a thinker as the rest of us, that he disagreed with himself and he disagreed with his own theological positions and also his poetic positions. So I think there's a lot more of it about than we might imagine. And I think what's something that's going on in modern poetry studies as well is a lot of the things that we were all taught in school are being questioned. So the idea that poetry is made up of stressed and unstressed beats, this is in the last sort of 10, 15 years been all thrown up in the air. And there's now this idea of relative stress, which is one's more interested in how different syllables are stressed relative to one another rather than there's just these two categories of stressed and unstressed. So I think how complex this stuff is probably an infinite question, but I hope that adds something to your question.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
I just say, it's extraordinary. I didn't know this, that the Victorian children were taught the Latin poetry and this stress on the end of the line, because I mean, there's a long tradition of English poetry that breaks with that. I mean, there's Shakespeare's poetry where you do exactly that, and it gets quite boring. But on the other hand, when the sentence goes over the end of the line and the sentence ends in the middle of the line, then it's much more interesting to listen to, isn't it?
Yeah, it's fascinating. And I think something that we all have to try and fit into our minds, which is very hard, is that people that went to school up until, in the scope of history, relatively recently, up until about 120 years ago, nearly everything they would have been doing in school every day would be Latin and Greek. And so the sense of how metre works would have been so part of their way of thinking that a line has this many beats in and it sounds like this, such that when poetry doesn't keep to the lines, where it does run over the lines, they would be hearing in their sort of mind's eye the metre breaking at the end of the line in a way that we just can't really keep up with because we're not sort of massively schooled in that way of thinking. And for instance, someone like Tennyson, who's somebody else that I've worked on, was fascinated by this idea of hearing. And apparently when Tennyson would read his own poetry, it would boom towards the end of the line, and then he would go quiet again at the start of the line, and then boom at the end of the line again. And one of the most fascinating documents I've ever worked on is an account of an evening in a house in Bristol, where there was all sorts of famous people there, but sort of unimaginably, two of the people that were there were Tennyson and Gladstone. And Gladstone has this huge argument with Tennyson about how to read Greek poetry aloud, which is just mad that the Prime Minister was there saying that you've got this all wrong and you mustn't stress the end of the line. And Tennyson says, no, you must, because it adds more interest and it means that you can have sort of different textures of the verse running against each other. So there's a whole history of this and stuff. Yes, please.
You mentioned there the Roehampton notes.
Yeah.
He had multilingual notes. Do you know what languages they were? That's the first thing.
Yeah.
Second thing is you mentioned he had an interest in Welsh poetry.
Yes.
And did he have any influence from Irish poetry or poets? Do you have any evidence of that?
Both very good questions. So the notes are in Latin, Greek, and English, with a few quotations from Dante in Italian. But he wrote. He was mainly a classics lecturer. That's what he did for most of his life. And so he's very interested in the differences between Latin, Greek, and English poetry. Question about Irish poetry. That's not something I know much about. It hasn't come up in my research, which is not to say that it wasn't there. But he was very interested in nationality in a way that I think hasn't often been picked up on. There's a wonderful scholar at Tennessee University called Daniel Westover, who is writing a book about his Welsh identity and the fact that he might be considered what's now called in universities a post-colonial poet, because he saw Wales as this country that had been colonised by the English, and he was sort of taken out of this this world. So I'm afraid I don't have an answer to your question about Irish poetry, but the question of how he understood the different languages of these islands is a really detailed one that I think still there's a lot more work to be done on it.
Yeah, we're not aware of any Irish poems that you're
Right.
familiar with. No?
Yeah. I'm always reluctant to say no, in case somebody's found a notebook that I haven't found.
I'm just thinking about the speaking of ancient Greek and the fact that it was pitch-based rather than stress-based,
Yes.
and the degree to which they might have understood that it was pitch-based. I met 20 years ago, I met a man who was a lecturer in ancient Greek at Oxford, Cambridge, I forget which. And when I started to talk about pitch accented, he pooh-poohed me and said, oh no such thing, and so on and so forth. Thank God I didn't listen to it. But I wondered, at that stage, were they considering the pitch? Hopkins did, didn't he?
Yeah, Hopkins did. In the notes that I've just been talking about, the Roehampton notes, he goes into lots of detail about this idea of counterpoint. And I think this idea of pitch lies behind that you might be able to pitch things in one way but stress them in another way, so that the two
Just say that.
Yeah, that they can run over each other. And there's a wonderful diagram that I'll put this somewhere on my laptop, and put it up if anybody wants to see it, where he tries to sort of make a graphic out of this, and he sort of draws these wonderful lines that look like a scientific diagram about how you might read one of his poems in several different textures at once. And it's wonderfully sort of beautiful and also slightly balmy in a way that's quite brilliant.
But I found myself totally, I had no idea how to even approach.
Yeah.
How would you speak it?
Yes, and when he has all these really odd symbols, the counterpoint symbols and things that are meant to be instructive, but just a little more confused than you were when you began. And it's something I always found myself thinking about Hopkins is how much did he believe this himself? How much did he really think that you could read a poem in two different ways at the same time? And I suppose we'll never know the answer to that question. But I think his will to believe that is sort of integral to what I've been talking about today, that contradiction was so valuable to him, the fact that he felt that you could do this, and I'm going to devise however complex a method I need in order to show that you can do that, I think is really a big part of how he thought about everything. Whether it's theology or whatever.
He made it very hard for everyone.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I would say that, he understood Cwmhanedd, he loved Cwmhanedd. He used it in his English poetry. He wrote some Welsh poetry in Cwmhanedd. And it's a very complicated thing. I don't pretend to understand it. I've had lectures on it. I don't understand it. I get the idea of it. But I think that, because that is a sound-based form, that really comes in with this pitch thing as well. That he was able to hear these things in a way that I think a lot of people nowadays can't.
Yes.
He was attuned to that level of hearing.
Yes, I think that's exactly right. And also I think potentially different ways of hearing as well. And that I think all of us today really think of hearing as a sound goes into your ear, and what does that mean? But I think Hopkins also thought of hearing in a slightly different way as well, that given that he knew that this was the root part of the word and the rest of it was the sort of inflected grammatical endings, he could hear that part of the word in a different way to the other parts of the word, even though he wasn't literally hearing it differently, but in his mind it had a different sort of resonance because he was such a brilliant scholar and knew all about the history of words and that sort of thing. Which is something we see quite a lot in Italian poetry as well, because Italian is a very heavily inflected language, that there'll be the root part of the word and then almost the same number of letters again are added on to give it a tense or a gender or whatever. And so the way in which the different parts of the word have different types of interest is really integral to how Italian poetry works, and Dante was the sort of king of this type of writing. We should probably leave it there, shouldn't we?
Yes. Okay, so we'll take a little break and we'll come back in a few minutes and Gary will do his paper now.